Welcome to this retrospective reflection presentation. Many of you are here for passport events, to get your passport signed off. I am very willing to do that at the end of the presentation. Just form a line and I'll be the official signer. Secondly, anyone in my classes who is getting PDE credit, also, please make sure you see me at the end so I can write down, okay, that you're here. And my apologies in advance because of the masking. I don't know many of you as well as I would like at this point of the semester. I really do apologize for that. But so if I'm unclear as to what class of mine you're in and stuff, just please be forgiving. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. B.J. Cunningham. I'm Dean of the School of Graduate Studies. I really appreciate the time you're taking this morning to join us here as we pause from our busy lives and reflect on what happened 20 years ago tomorrow, 2001-2011. I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we'll have just a moment of silent reflection before we get started. So shortly we will begin with Professor Dr. David Contasta, who's a professor of history. We have Dr. Jackie Reich, is a professor of political science and international relations. Dr. Jeffrey Carroll is also a professor of political science. We all have different areas of expertise. We have history, international relations, domestic politics, and my expertise is in political violence and conflict resolution. So we're each going to be sharing a bit of our perspectives today. And what we want to do, though, is open it up. We're going to share some personal reflections on the day and then talk a little bit about terrorism in the event. And then we do want to open up and have an inclusive meetings. We want people to share any observations they have or ask questions and certainly engage in a dialogue. Okay? So without further ado, we'll have a moment of silent reflection, please. Professor Contasta?
Thank you. I'm delighted to see so many of you here, and if my glasses fog up, as they always do when I'm wearing a mask, I may have to just flip the mask off for a moment, otherwise I'm not going to be able to read these notes, and I'm far enough away from you, and I'm also vaccinated, so if you'll just excuse me here for a moment. I want to talk about the historical lessons we should have learned before 9/11. And I think if we had learned these historical lessons before 9/11, we would not have reacted as we did. And then I want to talk about the historical lessons I think we should have learned in the last 20 years since 9/11. And briefly, these historical lessons are these, and I'm going to then elaborate them. Number one, do not fight unnecessary wars. Number two, do not believe presidential lies or deceptions about the need to go to war. And number three, do not pass up possibilities of avoiding needless wars. I'm going to begin with this last point. Do not pass up possibilities of avoiding needless wars. And then I'll go on to the others. I'll give examples of each one. And I'm going to go all the way back to 1898. Historians like to start with Adam and Eve, or even before that. So I'm going to reach back about 123 years at this point. The United States was at war with Spain in 1898, and at the Battle of Manila Bay, the U.S. Navy completely smashed the Spanish fleet. And we decided we annexed the Philippine Islands. The Filipinos had been fighting against Spain for their independence for a number of years, and they didn't want to trade the United States for Spain. And in fact, at first, they thought that we were saviors, that in fact we would assist them in becoming independent. The leader of the rebels or the insurgents or whatever you want to call them in the Philippines, Emilio Aguinaldo, actually sent a personal emissary to Washington, D.C. to talk to President McKinley and to ask for the friendship and support of the United States. And McKinley fobbed him off. He said, I can't do anything for you. You can go to Paris and talk to the peace commissioners there if you want. He went to Paris and they wouldn't even receive him. They wouldn't listen to him at all. So there was a real possibility of the United States assisting the Filipino people in their independence. Instead, we fought a 2-year war against the Filipinos. The White House lied, in fact, when it said that the rebels had attacked Manila, which they had not done. And that war in the Philippines cost 4,234 American lives and as many as 200,000 Filipino lives. Fast forward to 1946, and there were some people alive in 1946 who would have been alive in 1899 and 1900 and 1901. That is, what had happened back in the Philippines was in the living memory of some people. And in 1946, ironically, the same year that we granted the Philippine Islands their independence, finally, in that very same year, President Truman decided to finance the French insistence on reconquering their Indo-Chinese empire. And of course, we Americans said, well, we're against imperialism and we're against colonialism. But we backed the French to the hilt. And of course, they were defeated at Dien Bien Phu. And then the United States picked up the cudgel and becomes embroiled in a civil war in Vietnam. Now, here again, we have an example of how this may have been avoided. Ho Chi Minh, who really was a war hero after World War II because he had fought against the Japanese. Japan had taken over Indochina. He wrote several letters to President Truman asking for the friendship and support and assistance of the United States. So we have two instances in which Filipinos are reaching out for friendship and support to us, and the Vietnamese are reaching out for friendship and support for us. The Pentagon Papers then reveal that 4 presidents in a row lied to the American people about what was going on in Vietnam, and the 5th one, Richard Nixon, also lied. The war in Vietnam cost 58,000 American lives and maybe the lives of 2 million Vietnamese civilians. Which then takes us up to 9/11. After Vietnam, many Americans said, never again. We're never going to make this kind of mistake again. And yet, 26 years later, we did exactly the same thing. And I'll get to how we could have avoided this too, particularly in Afghanistan. There's an interesting article in the New York Times just 2 weeks ago. The invasion of Afghanistan did make some sense because the Taliban was sheltering al-Qaeda there. But by November 2001, Taliban was ready to surrender to the United States, and they offered to surrender in exchange for amnesty. And the Bush administration said no, because they thought we could utterly defeat them and that we should not deal with them in any way. The neocons in the Bush administration, mainly Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, decided that we should attack Iraq, and we did divert a lot of resources from Afghanistan as a result thereof. They claimed that the Iraqis were sheltering al-Qaeda, which was not true, and they claimed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which also turned out not to be true. And then they switched their argument to what they called the reverse domino theory. And you may know that during the Cold War, Americans like to talk about the domino theory. You have a row of dominoes, you flip one down, and they all go down. The idea is if one country goes to communism, they'll all go down. The reverse domino theory is if the United States implants democracy in a Middle Eastern country and you flip the dominoes down, then democracy is going to spread throughout the Middle East. I could ask Jeffrey this question, Dr. Carroll this question. When I was a political science major back in college, we learned at one point that political systems evolve over long periods of time in concert with the history and the culture of the country, and that it's idiotic to think that one can implant democracy someplace where it's no longer existed. We also thought we could do what the British didn't do and what the Russians didn't do. The British fought the Afghans in 1839 and 1878 and 1919, and of course the Russians did in the 1980s, or should I say the Soviet Union did in the 1980s. But American hubris led us to believe that, oh, we could do what the British didn't do and we could do what the Soviets couldn't do. The Afghan war cost about 2,400 American lives and between 171,000 and 174,000 Afghan lives. And the Iraq war deaths were 300,000 for the Iraqis and 5,000 for the Americans. If you add this up, this is almost 500,000 lives. Now, of course, the 3,000 who were killed in 9/11 were terrible. But this is more than 100 times the number who were killed on 9/11, partly due to decisions, or maybe mainly due to decisions made by the United States. And these conflicts ended up costing us between $4 and $6 trillion if you count in all of the interest payments. And this money, of course, could have been used for all kinds of other issues. So my conclusion is the United States has to stop thinking that it can remake other countries in our own image. We can wish other countries well if they want to move towards democracy, and we can support them in that way. And Congress and the media and the American people need to be more skeptical about presidential pronouncements about the need to go to war. And this is a dangerous situation because if presidents continue crying wolf, we might have a real crisis and then they won't be believed. Now, I'm finally, I think, supposed to talk about 9/11, my experiences then. I remember that morning very well. I'd walked up to the bus stop with my two sons, David and John, who were 10 and 8 years old at that point, and I remarked to them, I don't think they remarked to me, but I remarked to them about the gorgeous, crystal clear blue sky that morning. It was extremely noticeable, and it was one of the first early autumn days, and I was reveling in that. That morning here at the college, I had, I think, what was the first promotion and tenure meeting of the semester. I think it was an organizational meeting. We had it in one of the labs down on the ground floor of St. Joseph's Hall, and as we came out, and I walked through the commuter lounges, what we called it back then, the TV was on, and the first tower had just been struck. And most of us thought it was probably an accident. That is, a plane had veered off course and had smashed it to that building. And then when the second plane hit, we knew that it was more than just an accident. I honestly don't remember much about the rest of the day. I don't remember whether I taught classes that day. I don't remember what I might have said in classes that day. I don't remember about going home. I think my wife and I told the boys that they were safe and that they didn't need to be afraid. And I think we tried to have a normal evening of dinner and homework and so forth. So I sort of blanked out, I guess, that day about what happened. So thank you.
First, I'd like to thank Dr. B.J. Cunningham. This was his idea to host this reflection, and for all of my co-panelists for what I know they'll have great insights. I want to talk about how the 9/11 attacks cast a huge impact on American foreign policy. but also on the American psyche. And I want to ask why, why was it so impactful? Why was 9/11 so shocking? And you just heard Professor Contasta talk about basically a shock, that it happened. So why was that? Basically, what we saw in the United States, we experienced the phenomenon of globalization, which we had been experiencing for the previous 10 years, but mostly in a positive way. And now we could see the dark underbelly of this globalization that we knew was happening, and it just took us all by surprise. Globalization, as you may know, just means the increasing interconnectedness of people, of countries, of groups, okay, irrespective of national borders. And I'm very aware that the undergraduate students in this room either weren't born when 9/11 happened, or are so little they cannot remember it. But, in 2001, it was still a very new thing that our world's borders had become porous. Porous in three ways, I would suggest. One was geopolitically. In 1991, we had the end of the Cold War, and suddenly half of the world that we were just so used to not being able to interact with, suddenly you could interact with them. And I'm talking about, of course, the Soviet Union and especially the East European allies. Now, in the 1990s, we were that part of the world was opening up to economic investment, to travel. And for the first time in a long time, people around the world could really connect. But that was a political change. And we were still very aware of it. Economically, as a result of the end of the Cold War, frankly, Americans saw as a great victory, a victory for liberal democracy, but also for market capitalism. After all, the communist societies had all crumbled. They were seen as economic failures. And so clearly, market capitalism was the way to go. The economic model for development, we even had a name for this, called the Washington Consensus, that we all agree this is the way to go. And so you saw an increase in trade, an increase in investment, rise in supply chain technologies, which are plaguing us right now in the pandemic, right? Why can't I get that part for my computer? Why can't I, get that part for my bicycle? Because those parts are now made around the world and not necessarily within a country. Well, this was all starting to become possible, and our economy was really changing. And the third way that we were interconnected was technologically, and it was just a great happenstance that you had the rise of the internet, the rise of fiber optic technology and satellite communications, making cell phone technology spread around the world. And so those of us old enough to remember how before, with landlines, how much it cost to talk to somebody, across the ocean, that all went away, right? So communication and information became so much more readily available. So you can just see how the 90s were creating this interconnection, and Americans saw it as very, very good, by and large. And the US was the unabashed superpower, okay? We saw the world as remaking itself in terms of us, liberal democracy, market capitalism, and military threats were far away because any country that would be attacking us seemed to not really be around anymore. There's still the nuclear threat, but suddenly that just seemed so much more dampened with all of this interconnectedness, and didn't seem like nuclear attack was so possible. And so, you know, the United States, so used to our geographic position of Canada to the north. The last time the Defense Department, which is paid to be paranoid, right? The last time the Defense Department had active plans for how to counter an attack from Canada was in the 1930s. And in a military attack from Mexico, also unthinkable. And on the east and the west are the oceans. So we felt very safe, felt very, very safe. But the 9/11 attack showed this horrific underside to all this interconnectedness. You know, as is well known now, Al-Qaeda was able to take advantage of all of these positive things and use them in their own way. And so just because threats from countries were no longer available, or so possible, the United States really underappreciated the threats from what we call non-state actors, groups that might have an agenda and might want to do something. That was very underappreciated because, attacks always come from countries. Economic interconnectedness made it possible for Al-Qaeda to finance their terror plans all the way from the other side of the world. Now, and emphasize from the other side of the world. This was all new that this could happen. And technological advances made it possible for the plan to be coordinated so that it could all happen on 9/11 from the headquarters, which was located in Afghanistan. And Americans, by and large, were blind to this threat. We didn't appreciate the cultural backlash that was building to all of this American preeminence of cultural values from the West. And a political scientist at Harvard University had written about a possible backlash, how this could take place. And this was a guy named Samuel Huntington, and he wrote this article in 1991 at the end of the Cold War. Well, 10 years had to pass before suddenly, holy cow, that guy seemed to hit the nail on the head. Why do these people hate us? Why did they coordinate this attack on us? And it really did turn out to be a big cultural disconnect. Everybody didn't necessarily want to have our Western values, our market economy, our political liberalness. Okay. Yeah, so the motivation was there. I want to point out that Chestnut Hill College is really advanced, in our wisdom. We instituted the Global Studies class requirement back in 1999. We were really at the leading edge of this wave of something fundamentally different is happening, this interconnectedness. Okay. Unfortunately, then there was great fodder afterwards, after 9/11, to talk about how it's all not going to be positive. And so I want to just stop my academic presentation by saying that, we Americans, in answering the question, why was this so shocking? We Americans, so used to our oceans and protecting us, having friendly countries on our border, we now became aware that we were vulnerable in a horrible new way that was truly shocking. And I expect that many of today's reflections will demonstrate the shock that people felt that day. And I want to give an almost ludicrous example from my own experience. Shortly after the 9/11 attacks, people will remember that there was attacks of putting anthrax in envelopes and either hand delivering them or sending them through the mail. Well, since nobody had ever envisioned that, you could use planes as basically bombs and target buildings and go, it suddenly seemed like you could be attacked from anthrax anywhere. And I remember talking to my neighbor, and I live in Springfield, Delaware County. I mean, it is like, the wholesome suburbs, why would anybody be attacking there? We now know so much more about global terrorism. But at the time, it was so shocking that 9/11 had happened, maybe somebody would do an aerial attack of anthrax. And so I was talking with my neighbor about how I remembered hearing on the radio how important it was to get masking tape and to tape I've seen nods, the inside of my windows so that anthrax in the air couldn't seep into my house. In retrospect, 20 years later, that's not high on the list of risks from global terrorism, but that just displays the shock and how suddenly anything seemed possible to our security. Thanks.
Just wanted to make a couple of brief comments on the impact of 9/11 on American politics and specifically American political science. And the way that you can think about this is that the questions that we raised as citizens, and in turn, our citizenry and in the scholarship of political science didn't about face. We were, after 9/11, we were asking new questions. We were all across all domains of politics, and the way you can think about our public sphere in America, and in turn, political science, as you think about it as the formal structural institutions, like the three branches of government and all those things in government that intersects them and the people and behavior. Okay, behavior of our political actors, like the president, like Congress, like the courts, but also to the public, me and you. Okay, so the questions that we faced, domestic politics, as messy as it already is, certainly went about face. I'd be remiss in just to think that I could possibly explain what the breadth of that may look like, but I can give you just a couple of examples of some points of emphasis in political science that change. And the way we can think about this is, how were the questions reframed? They were reframed at the heart of American political science and its discipline. So in public opinion, or those attitudes that you and I feel about government and politics, we had to come to grips with how we understood the event, the specific event of that day of 9/11. What happened? Who was responsible? What is the response going to be? And then as the days ticked on from 9/11, how do we understand the legacy of that? How do we evaluate our leaders? What is the relationships with groups that are involved in, especially this term called outgroups, which we can talk about later if you wish? Trust of government, patriotism. And when I think about that public opinion, and to think about the consensus that we had in Americans 20 years ago, that it was a source of consensus and patriotism in a period of America that I believe have happened in few times in history. We've really reshaped our questions then about where we turn as a response, didn't we? How did the three branches of government respond? The discipline was reshaped, and believe it or not, in and around this time, there was lack of scholarship with attention on the president. David, we often left the historians to deal with questions of presidential power, but it was a reinvigoration in political science because the discipline responds to real-world events. Okay, and whatever is particularly salient in Americans' minds is that's the questions that political scientists attempt to answer. In terms of the president, how could we bring justice to the victims? How do we find out who's responsible, face justice? How can we make sure that America is not attacked again? And as Dr. Reich mentioned, I mean, that was a very scary time with anthrax that happened not too long after the 9/11 events. I remember folks being scared, me included, to just open the mail. The significant expansion of presidential power over time, because they were about face and constitutional measures that held forth before to protect it, is just parts of the Constitution could be suspended in times of emergency and crisis and war. And what does that look like, though? There were new arms of the bureaucracy that the president was attending to. The Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, is now the third biggest branch of the bureaucracy now. Interestingly, as President George W. Bush was commanding this, he actually had some objections to how the bureaucracy was going to be reorganized, and then he ended up, of course, taking and enforcing the law through it. Then there was Congress. How has lawmaking changed after 9/11? I think the biggest case study here is those laws that related to security. And we can probably talk ad nauseum about what the Patriot Act is and the legacy of the Patriot Act. Actually, the law itself was actually very lengthy in title. Actually, I had to write it down. I didn't remember the full title. It's Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism. So all sorts of laws and policy related to counterterrorism efforts. By the way, in any discussion of Congress, you have to talk about the money that's spent. We ramped up defense spending. Estimates about $2 trillion to $6 trillion that's spent in support of 9/11. In addition to that large reorganization of the bureaucracy, we have spent right out of your pockets a lot of change. And then finally, the courts. Interpretation about what was going on, and the courts, what do? They interpret laws, right? Constitution, though, it's as far as constitutionalism, one that I am particularly fascinated about and interested in is preserving American civil liberties at the same time of providing protection in this time that we have to engage into counterterrorism. The courts, they struck down provisions of the Patriot Act, actually. It was stronger in surveillance than in the initial draft than what it came to be, and what we found out much, much, much later as documents were unclassified, so forth, is that that type of surveillance by the FBI, CIA, and otherwise extended all the way down to the citizenry, as far down as surveilling your cell phone records. I can go on and on and on, but let me just stop there, because American political science also, it just grappled with all of these questions. I graduated college in 2001, the May right before September 11th. And to think that I had gone through my undergraduate studying American politics pre-9/11, and then my graduate study happened right afterwards. It was an interesting perspective at the shift and everything: media politics, federalism, political parties and partisanship, and how that's changed over time, in interest groups and social movements and advocacy, and as I mentioned, civil rights, and particularly civil liberties. What I recall from that day is that I was working at a law firm, and interestingly, like my friend David, there's parts of that day that I remember the morning, and the rest of the day is actually very fuzzy. And had checked the news as I got into my office, and I worked at the 38th floor of the Bell Atlantic Tower, which is the Verizon Tower. It's the big kind of steeply top building in Center City, Philadelphia, and seeing that a plane had hit the World Trade Center, the first plane. Someone was just grasping to get a live feed, because then it was like, how do you get this on TV? We were going to find a TV. And as someone went to try to find this, got the message that we were going to be ushered out of there quickly. It would drop everything that you have and run and we got to the elevators, but then I do remember that I had to, that it was only, I couldn't go all the way down to 38th floor. I went down to another set of stairs and we were out of there. And then when we got to the bottom, the message was delivered to us that there was another plane. They think it's coming towards Center City, Philadelphia. It may be headed to downtown. As you can imagine, the communication channels were shut off. I took the subway into the office that day. We couldn't take the subway, couldn't get in contact with my family, and of course, we were worried tremendously about each other. And walking streets crowded, not knowing what's going on. I live at 42nd in Baltimore and West Philadelphia. If anybody knows that walk from Center City into West Philly is not very far, but when you're on foot and you're scared and people are crowded in the streets, very tumultuous time. So thank you for allowing me to give my points today and offer that reflection. Thanks.
Let's begin with a brief reflection. In 2001, my wife Liz and I were living in Arlington, Virginia, about 4 miles from the Pentagon. Liz worked at the IMF World Bank Joint Library downtown DC. I worked at American University up in Northwest Washington. And I remember that morning when we heard the first news of the attack, and I looked on my initial thought was a plane going into the towers. I remembered my history. I think it was 1945 or 1946 when a B-25 bomber went into the Empire State Building. But it was an accident because it was all due to fog. So I thought, well, it's a beautiful day in Washington. Let me take a look and see what it's like in New York. And it was a beautiful day. And I knew at that moment it was intentional and certainly not an accident. Later that day, we pulled together, and we had a gathering on the main quad at AU, a spiritual ceremony to gather everybody. And we had the rabbi, the priest, an imam, and a Protestant minister, which sounds like the beginning of a bad joke. But we gathered everybody together on the quad to just be together, to experience a sense of something drastic has changed. And we prayed for the victims and prayed for the future. And at the end, just as we were breaking up, 2 F-18s, Navy aircraft, flew over the campus, flew over the quad, flying a combat air patrol over Washington. And, it wasn't until later we learned they had orders to shoot down any threats to the city, including civilian aircraft. So we knew that day had changed forever. I was working on my PhD in conflict resolution at George Mason University, and the fall semester was actually my first semester of doing my dissertation proposal. So after 9/11, I switched it to terrorism and conflict resolution because I'd researched terrorism in the 1990s after the end of the Cold War. So I had 2 research questions. First was, under what conditions does terrorism arise? And the second question was, what are the most effective ways of countering terrorism? After 5 years and 624 pages, I had a few answers in my dissertation.
Now you got to do it
So if you're thinking about a PhD, come and talk to me. So there's 4 ways in which we frame the problem of terrorism. The first, we think of it as a form of warfare, or we think of it as a crime, or we think of it as a liberation struggle. And finally, we can think of it as a complex social phenomenon, which is what most social scientists think of it as. Part of the problem is observer bias, and it depends on your relationship to the victims or the perpetrators. So if you identify with the victims, you're going to think of it as an act of war, as an act of crime. If you identify with the perpetrators, you're going to think of it as an act for a liberation struggle. And this is one of the challenges. There's the old cliche, one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist, and vice versa. But it is true. Kreisberg, a researcher, tells us there's 4 conditions necessary for social conflict. The first is that parties must think of themselves as separate. That is, parties meaning people, groups, nations. We have to think of ourselves as separate. Second, one or more of the parties must have a grievance. they must have less of what they want or need. Third, one or more of the parties must create a goal to change the other. So if they believe that the problem is not them, the problem is the other, and they must change. And finally, that aggrieved party must believe they can be successful in changing the other. And those are the necessary conditions for any kind of social conflict, including political violence. There's two key variables when we're looking at what type of political violence emerges. And those variables are political motivation, how motivated are people, and political mobilization. Are a lot of people mobilized and willing to act? When you have low motivation and low mobilization, you end up with crime as a form of violence. When you have low motivation and high mobilization, you end up with riots. When you have high mobilization and high motivation, you have conventional warfare. It's when you have low mobilization and high motivation is when you get terrorism. Terrorism is a form of elite conflict. It's not a mass conflict. And part of the thing that's important about this is that terrorism is not an end in and of itself. What the terrorists are trying to do is spark a wider conflict. Nobody wakes up in the morning saying, I want to be a terrorist. What they do is they wake up and they say, I want to be a freedom fighter. I want to be the personification of my people's liberation struggle. So what they're trying to do with these acts of terrorism is to mobilize the people who are within their aggrieved group or they're in their identity group. They're trying to spark an insurgency, which would then lead to either a revolution or a civil war. Revolutions are usually more preferable because they're less damaging than civil wars. That's really the terrorist strategy. The core problem there is that the acts of terrorism feed back to the sources of conflict. The counterterrorism responses from the government also often overreact and, again, feed those sources of conflict. So what we end up in is this endless feedback loop of violence by a terrorist organization followed by state violence. And that state violence can also trigger wider conflict, as we've already heard. So some of the things I wanted to look at were different models for counterterrorism. I explored a lot. Paul Pillar is a former CIA analyst, and he came up with an interesting model, which has two different types of terrorist groups, and he terms them unidimensional and multidimensional. And it depends on what kind of group you have, and then what is the appropriate response. So unidimensional terrorist groups are unrepresentative of a wider target population. They also only engage in violence. So these are usually very small splinter groups that don't represent wider people, as opposed to some of the larger groups that have a large following. And those are multidimensional. They represent a wider socioeconomic and political interests, and they operate on multiple ways other than violence. For example, Hezbollah in Lebanon runs schools and hospitals. They run social services. So they're a multidimensional group. They don't just have acts of violence. So I took his model and went one further. In the conflict resolution theories, there's three main ways that people engage in conflict and in conflict resolution processes. The first is power. Okay? We use power to resolve the conflict and win. The second approach is that we take rights-based approach, and rights based on our legal rights. So we look at courts, we look at political systems to solve those problems. Finally, we look at underlying interests. What are the interests driving the people? Because if you solve those underlying interests, you don't deal with the symptoms of the conflict, you deal with the root causes. So when we match those two models together, what we have is we have power. Terrorism is therefore seen as a form of warfare, and the appropriate response, as Pillar says, is exterminate. So one thing you can do with terrorists, if it's framed as warfare, is kill them. The second, if you frame it as rights, it's seen as a crime. And with crime, what do? You incarcerate them. You find them and lock them up. Those are two core things that we have done and continue to do with terrorists. The third one is one that most people don't think of. If you're looking at this as underlying interests, it's a complex social problem, and you engage. You negotiate. Well, not every terrorist group wants to negotiate. And, quite frankly, Every government across the world, most Western democracies, have it as their stated political policy that we do not negotiate with terrorists. That is utter nonsense. Governments negotiate with terrorist groups when they believe it's in their interest to do so. So there's negotiations about ceasefires. There's negotiations about hostage exchanges. There's negotiations about prisoner releases. The Israelis, the United States, the British, the Irish governments, all over the world negotiate when it's in their best interest to do so. So my focus was on political processes at the strategic level and hostage negotiations at the tactical level. The FBI has an 88% success rate at resolving hostage situations without violence. So looking at conflict resolution, now again, not every terrorist group wants to negotiate, and it is not appropriate to negotiate with every single terrorist group, so we have a decision analysis. Is a terrorist group multidimensional? Are they wider than just a violent organization? Do they represent a wider constituency? Can they withstand government forces? That's one of the things that led to the peace process in Northern Ireland. The British government could not defeat the IRA, even though they had severely infiltrated them. Are their issues difficult but negotiable? It comes back to what are those underlying interests? What are they seeking? What are those grievances about? And can we actually engage them and resolve it? Are there intermediaries available within their social group who can represent them in those negotiations? And finally, is the conflict ripe for resolution? Unfortunately, some conflicts have to reach a stalemate point. Everybody wants to win in a violent conflict. You don't want to give up until you reach a point of stalemate where you really can't go any further, and then it becomes ripe for looking at alternative solutions. I'll leave you with a final thought. It is from a professor from the University of Ulster. I studied in Northern Ireland. The practical alternative to negotiation is the apparatus of repression. Blazing guns, bleak prisons, intrusive surveillance, always evil in themselves. Thank you. Now, we do have time, so we really would like to open this up to questions, to comments, and invite you if you have anything that you'd like to say or ask any questions of our panelists.
I was hearing talk about values and that not necessarily everyone may want to accept or adopt our values. However, I wasn't alive at the time, and I don't know a whole bunch of political history. However, I do know that the United States has a history of interfering with other countries, inserting leaders, killing leaders. I question if it is possibly more related to concrete wrongs that the United States have done against other countries, and that it's less of a thing about values. I don't know.
Okay. I sometimes will joke when I teach American foreign policy that you really only need to know one thing to understand the motivation for American policy during 1945 to 1991, and that is, was it anti-Soviet? And so, there are these great one-liners, like someone asking President Johnson, why we were supporting this terrible dictator in the Dominican Republic in the 1960s. And he was famous for saying, well, yeah, he may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. Okay, in other words, he's not Soviet, he's not pro-Soviet. Oh my goodness, so many horrible policy decisions were made in terms of this prism of, how's this going to tally in terms of our overall fight with the Soviet Union?
And I would just add, we had an opportunity right after Mao Zedong defeated Chiang Kai-shek in China to open up discussions and relations. He wanted to do it. And the old China hands, that is, people who knew about China, thought that we would wait for a year or two and then recognize China, obviously, if Mao's in control. It's not until the Russian Revolution in 1917 that the United States said, well, we're not going to talk to you, we're not going to do anything with you because you're bad and you're evil and so forth. Before that, the attitude was if a government is in power, we might as well recognize them and deal with them. So we started doing that in 1917. There were various overtures from the Soviet Union, particularly after Stalin died, and the attitude here was, well, they're liars, we can't trust them, we're not going to talk to them, they're bad people, and so forth.
You know, I think some of the limitations of the Clash of Civilizations kind of thesis that Huntington had is that it makes the Middle East a little bit monolithic, just in terms of who the people are, and then just distilling it as if those countries don't have various differences in interests and are different and are just pit between this is different than Western values. And as you read that thesis, there's part of it that makes sense about the motivations of why some of those folks would be aggrieved. But when you kind of square that away with some of the tangential, like the things that, let's say, Osama bin Laden was really worried about. I mean, in his head, it was, about the presence of American troops in and around the region and a sustained presence over time. Is that a cultural beef? Is it otherwise? Is it economic one or political one? So that's something I think about as you ask that question is part and parcel a little bit of that limitation of what Huntington was saying.
We have time for a question or two.
Like terrorism as the United States, we look at it as global. And my issue is like, why don't we look at like domestic terrorism? Because we kind of saw that build up happening, and it's happening right now. So, why don't we talk about domestic as much as we do international?
So my only point about emphasizing global terrorism, that it was new to American, and it really was new in a global sense. But terrorism goes back to biblical times. Okay? The term terrorism was coined during the French Revolution. You can, when you study terrorism, people talk about state terrorism, meaning it's the government that's doing the terrorizing, versus what I tended to focus on, which was sub-state actor, And to Americans, it was new as phenomenon. There are terror groups followed by the FBI, throughout our history for quite a long time. So thank you for giving us the opportunity to distinguish between that. So I'm only trying to point out, why are we making a big deal about meeting on 9/11? That was all I was trying to explain.
I'm going to follow up on that, Jackie. Actually, the United States does have a history of domestic terrorism. Look back in the 60s, we had the Weather Underground. We also had the Symbionese Liberation Army, some of the Black Panthers. So we did have mostly left-leaning terrorist groups that emerged in the tumult of the 1960s, part of the anti-Vietnam movement, part of the liberation movement, as also part of the civil rights movement as an outgroup. So we did have highly mobilized college students on campuses around the United States in the 1960s, really exploring different ways to participate peacefully and some, unfortunately, not peacefully. So those were focused on left-leaning terrorist groups in the 60s and even into the 70s. Now, of course, what we're seeing are the emergence of a lot of right-leaning groups. So we have the white supremacists, which are posing the greatest threat right now since the January 6th assault on the Capitol. So thank you for bringing that up. We certainly are not immune in our own history and our own politics from the problem of homegrown terrorism.
Just want to throw in there, one of the greatest blots is, of course, Jim Crow South and the Ku Klux Klan and government tacit approval, support, looking the other way, however you want to frame it. And that terror that went on for decades.
And the Klan still exists. It's had 3 lives right after the Civil War. Then it emerged in the 1920s in the North. And then, of course, it emerged again at the time of the Civil Rights Movement. I just want to make one other point, and goes back. Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History in the early 1990s, in which he predicted after the fall of the Soviet Union, the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the whole world was going to move towards Western democracy and capitalism. And in the latest afterword to his book, he's changed his mind, and he's blamed it on the emergence or reemergence of tribalism. And that's a real problem in this country now, and it's been exacerbated by certain political figures.
I'm going to make a little bit of a stronger point. I believe that post 9/11, there's this ugly dynamic of a conflation of what constitutes international terrorism and domestic terrorism. Inside the United States, the thought that there were this diaspora, an increasing amount of terrorist cells within the United States, just the thought of that provided justification of an unprecedented shift of resources and personnel, and in terms of our politics, from a body of law enforcement to counterterrorism. The FBI shifted its focus from a law enforcement type, investigatory type agency to a counterterrorist one. It expanded its budget by billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars. So this is, in turn, inside the United States, a part of the domestic puzzle here, that as you talk about global terrorism and thinking about the events of 9/11, what are the political, the after effects of that? And we're just recently finding out, I mean, because of unclassified documents about folks coming forward to talk about and providing their own retrospective of actors inside of government, folks that were there in the FBI, in Congress, making decisions at the time, right? That these things were happening because there was a lot of that was shut out of the public's eye. And for us and political scientists, you know, it's this empirical phenomena. You can only study what you can observe. So I think we are actually going back to study that now. And thank you for the question. What we're actually finding is that there is this interrelation that we had never really had seen before. And it's one of a very complicated and complex kind of interweaving when you make the definitions of global terrorism and domestic terrorism that need to be handled concurrently.
Just conscious of the time, we'll be mindful of that. So I want to thank our panelists this morning. Thank you, Professor Catasta, Professor Reich, Professor Carroll. I want to thank all of you for coming out today. I appreciate you all taking the time to come out this morning, and I also thank the folks who are watching at home and at their desktops, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
That's the lady I want.